Is this a largely symbolic move, or is it, nevertheless important?
I think it's important. And it's difficult to say that it's purely symbolic. I don't know whether you know this, but I was a witness at the International Hague Court in The Hague over the Balkans over a particular trial there. And I'm actually working on one from Kosovo at the moment as a witness. I've been asked to get engaged in that. So I've been involved in some of these things in the past, and they take a long time. But the reality is we have had appearing in these courts people like Milosevic and Mladic and Karadzic and some senior hoods who've done some really nasty things around the place. So this is not just symbolic. We are in a world now where some senior leadership does need to recognize that it can end up, maybe many years later, but it can end up in an international court. Now, the ICC is controversial to some degree, and of course America has not signed up to it, so it's not universal. But the reality or the fact that they have issued this arrest warrant, I think, is important. It does send a message, particularly to those who are sitting on the fence over this Ukrainian business, the neutrals, and many serious countries around the world, like India and Brazil and many of the African countries. So it does send an important message, I think.
Message, though, but in practical terms, how realistic is it to see Putin in court in his lifetime, in our lifetime?
I don't think it will happen, but it might, is the truth.
What's the best chance of making that happen?
Well, the best chance, I suppose, I mean, taken to extreme, and frankly, I don't think this is going to happen, but is that Russia suffers a ignominious defeat over the whole Ukrainian business, and that Putin is overthrown, and that whoever overthrows him throws him to the wolves, in inverted commas. So, that's possible. I don't think it's probable, but that's about the only way I think he's going to end up in this court. I mean, it probably will restrict his travel arrangements and so forth, because there will be plenty of people around the world who'd be more than happy to try and arrest him and take him.
Yeah.
So he may end up by having these restrictions on his future life, but I think the chance of him actually ending up in the ICC is pretty small. I mean, that is a reality.
So it makes it hard for him to travel, apart from to his sort of allies who aren't going to dob him in. I mean, that's the sort of practical implication here.
Yeah, sure. I mean, China obviously is an example of that, and Iran, but I don't know about you, but I don't fancy spending my holidays in those sorts of places. So,
well, I'm sure there are many delightful destinations there. You mentioned the US not having signed up to the ICC. Does it need to get a move on to set a moral example at the very least?
Well, I think it does on balance, but one has to tread a little bit carefully in these arenas because you have to be conscious of what you're what you're letting yourself in for, in inverted commas. I mean, I don't want to broaden the debate, but everything from the European Court of Justice to the Hague to these international courts and so forth, you have to look at who's running them, what's their background, and what's their intent, and what's lying behind it. I think at the end of the day, the Americans should be part of it, but I can understand why they have decided not to thus far. What will be interesting is to see how they react to Putin being harangued by the court, because they can't have it both ways. They can't say this is a wonderful thing to do, and at the same time, want to stay out of it all. So
very tricky. Just finally, how, in terms of the evidence, it seems incredibly clear cut. Presumably, the evidence has been gathered, that effort has gone on, so it's all sort of the nuts and bolts are there.
Well, yeah, I would be cautious here, and I don't want to sound unhelpful in one sense, but I've been involved in a lot of operations around the world, 3 times in the Balkans, both the Iraq wars, Northern Ireland, and various other places. We need to be very careful about assuming what's going on here. And things like casualty figures are notoriously inaccurate at this stage in the game. And the reality is, and I don't, in one sense, don't like saying it, but the reality is there'll be nasty things happening on both sides of this equation. And, we've seen that in the Balkans. Initially, the people who were arraigned in court in The Hague were all Serbian. Then they branched out into Croats and others. We assumed that the Serbs were the baddies in Kosovo, but the KLA were not a nice bunch of people. There are very rarely goodies and baddies in this business.
Yeah.
So, yes, of course, the Russians are doing terrible things. And I was reading in the Sunday Times only a couple of weeks ago about this business of child applications, which are awful. But don't think that Ukrainians are completely white in this. They're not. And sadly, there will be stuff coming out in maybe months or years to come on both sides of this story.